So, welcome to Sydney Pacific. So this is fourth lecture this year, this academic year at Sydney Pacific. This event is part of our long-running lecture series sponsored by the MIT Presidential Fellows Program and hosted by the Sydney Pacific Committee on Scholarly Interactions. So today we're honored to have Professor Daron Acemoglu. Professor Acemoglu is the Killian Professor of Economics at MIT. And in 2005, he received the Clark Medal, one of the most prestigious awards in economics. So let us welcome Professor Acemoglu, who will share with us today his insights on why nations fail.
Hi, can you hear me? Is this working fine? No, that's what I thought. I'm not sure what this is. Hello? Oh, yeah, now it's working. Okay. All right. Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. And I'm going to talk about Why Nations Fail, which is a book that James Robinson and I have co-authored. It's essentially, the book sort of came out of many years of research that James and I engaged in, mostly jointly, but also sometimes without being totally stuck to each other. And you know, most of that research was sort of academic for academic audiences, but it was also trying to tackle some of the questions that are, we think, central for social science and economics. In particular, about the origins of poverty, prosperity, and the huge gap in income per capita that exists around the world. In particular, the economics profession, discipline, really got its start, as many of you know, by The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's monumental work that laid the foundations of economics as a discipline and as a science. And Adam Smith was very much motivated by the questions related to the wealth and poverty of nations, as the title of the book indicates. But at the time Adam Smith was writing, the gap between the richest and the poorest nation in the world was probably about 4 or 5-fold. Since then, we live in a much more globalized, integrated world, and the economics discipline has made huge strides towards being a more complete understanding of the set of economic issues that it focuses on. But the mystery of the gap between the richest and the poorest nations has widened considerably, and the gap between the richest and the poorest nation is over 50-fold. So with such a huge question, of course, theories abound, but part of the motivation for our writing this book for a general audience was that, in fact, we think that many of the theories that are most dominant in the media or in the popular press, or sometimes even in academia, aren't really helpful for understanding what we thought and what our research indicated are the main causes of this huge gap. And so our purpose was to try to do two things at the same time. One was to sort of try to put the disparate articles that we had written in an academic, scholarly fashion, which sort of take a particular question and go after that question in isolation to some extent of the other issues that are related to it. So try to force ourselves to sort of come up with a somewhat more unified framework for thinking about these issues, and at the same time make some of these ideas somewhat more broadly accessible to an audience that could potentially be interested, but generally doesn't sort of perhaps hear as much the perspective that we were trying to develop it. So to give you a bit of a sense of where this comes from before sort of introducing our main ideas, which is what I'm going to do really in a sort of short talk, introduce the main ideas, illustrate them with 1 or 2 examples, then open up for discussion. You know, it's also sort of useful before we introduce, we think about our ideas. So what sort of other perspectives people bring to thinking about why there is such huge gulf between rich and poor nations. So if you turn to the pages of magazines such as Science or Nature, sometimes you get these articles written by quite reputable scientists. You see the same thing in other contexts, with World Bank publications, United Nations, WHO, that sort of has this perspective that goes back to Montesquieu, that still not good. Okay, perhaps I should try to bring this closer to. Hi. I can shout, but I'm not sure whether the microphone is helping all that much. Is it possible to sort of put up the volume of the microphone? Okay, well, I'll try to scream in the meantime. So if you turn to these sort of views, then you'll read that these huge gaps exist in large parts because some nations are geographically well endowed and some nations are not geographically well endowed. Montesquieu, for example, thought that the climate of a nation was the key determinant of its economic performance. Now, we don't sort of always subscribe to Montesquieu's view, but arguing that natural endowments or soil quality or disease environment, certain geographic characteristics that are not in the control of individuals or society at large are the key factor determining prosperity is hugely widespread. Even more widespread, perhaps, would be the view that goes back to Max Weber when he formulated it in his sort of famous book on Protestant ethic, that there are certain cultural characteristics that are really deeply rooted in people's traditions, minds, that they carry with themselves. He was drawing the difference between Catholic and Protestant culture. And those cultural attitudes determine whether people are hardworking, they are innovative, they are open to new ideas, they go after the right sort of activities. And those are the main determinants of why some nations are poor. So for example, when the Haitian earthquake shook, people got interested in why Haiti was so much poorer, one of the poorest nations in the world, certainly the poorest nation in the Americas, and the newspapers were filled with articles arguing, Haiti did not have the right culture of work, and it had to sort of get its values right, and so on and so forth. And so it's a sort of a very, very widely held view. An even more dominant view, which is one that I think social scientists in general are quite partial to, which is that it's sort of an enlightened leadership view. It goes along the following lines that, nations do well economically when they adopt the right policies. So this is going to come a little bit close to the sort of ideas that we're going to put forward. But these policies are at the end determined whether they have enlightened leaders or they have leaders who listen to enlightened advisors. And the reason why economists like this is because we see ourselves as enlightened advisors giving the advice to the listening leaders. And so when you adopt the wrong policies, you have severe Great Depressions or not enough growth. If you adopt the right policies, you have the right growth, and all you need to do for the right policy, either you need just the enlightened leader or you need the right sort of economics or the right sort of social science to give you the advice. And of course there is some truth to all of these theories, but what we argue is that none of these three ideas are really that important. Instead, actually at some level, our perspective is that the right explanation starts with something not so far from textbook economics, but with a twist. In textbook economics, we sort of come to the world with a very well-defined set of economic institutions. For example, if you, for all those of you who have seen an economics course, you will start with these assumptions, very, very strict assumptions about competitive markets. Very well-defined order, property rights. I sell you something, I get that back. I can enter into contracts, I can borrow money, I can hire as many workers as I want in the market. So those sort of economic institutions, they make sense perhaps in writing an introductory economics textbook. But if you actually look at history, or even today, the world looks very different. Those sorts of economic institutions are actually not the norm. Many societies throughout the ages have been ruled not by this sort of competitive market, but very monopolistic markets. In fact, not even any freedom of people to supply their labor, but labor coercion, slavery, other forms of very restrictive labor practices that determine what one person could do, what another person could do, and how the rents would be divided from those activities. Contracts of all sorts, financial product market labor contract were very heavily regulated for one reason or another. So our starting point is that those economic institutions are hugely important. And for a reason that's going to become clear in 1 second, we call the sort of textbook example economic institutions inclusive economic institutions. They provide secure property rights, fairly equal playing field, level playing field, so that each individual could freely choose whatever occupation they want, and they have a chance to succeed in that occupation. And they can enter into any kind of contracts, and there is some sort of unbiased legal system that enforces those contracts. But, as I said, those inclusive economic institutions aren't the norm, they are the exception. Instead, most countries throughout the ages are ruled by what we call extractive economic institutions, which think of it as a sort of an ideal type that's the opposite extreme. In secure property rights, very tilted playing field that advantages one group, one set of individuals at the expense of another, very endemic lack of law and order, rule of law, unbiased judicial system, and so on. But the question is, why do these extractive economic institutions exist? And here, the sort of label we give to it, extractive, should give you an idea. We argue that these extractive institutions exist not because of some policy mistake, not because there were some unenlightened leaders who didn't see what would be good for their society. That happens, of course, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is that even though those are not very good at unleashing the full potential of a society, not good at bringing sustained economic growth, they create advantages for certain groups. They create advantages for those groups who sit at the top of the tilted playing field. They create advantages for those people who benefit from insecure property rights, or from the people who do the extraction. So therefore, we argue that extractive economic institutions exist endemically and are a prime reason for why certain societies, many societies, are unable to grow, unable to benefit from the technologies and the growth opportunities that exist in our globalized, integrated world. And they exist because they create advantages for certain groups at the expense of the rest of society. They create advantages for those who are politically powerful, which I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, the elite society. So as soon as I sort of give these very brief introduction, it should probably become quite clear that once you go down this path, although we started from a textbook economic model, the importance of these economic institutions, we've come actually quite far from the textbook economic model, because what we've said is that actually the textbook economic institutions are quite useful for generating economic growth, but actually most societies don't have them. They have an entirely different set of institutions. So if we focus on competitive labor markets and ignore coercion, slavery, other forms of regulations that create cheap labor for employers at the expense of the labor suppliers, don't encourage education, don't provide opportunities for the majority of the people, create monopolies and so on, well, those are not going to be covered by our usual model. But even more fundamentally, we have to take a foray into politics of institutions, because while these extractive institutions exist because they benefit the elite, but how is it that the elite are able to impose or maintain these institutions if they are not good for the rest of society? And there comes the interaction between economics and politics. And to give you a sense of this, let's think of a particular historical case. Barbados in the 17th century is an ideal example for an extractive institution. That was a plantation economy, a slave colony. 80% of the population were slaves. They were working at terribly brutal conditions, as witnessed by the fact that many of them died before the age of, before they saw their 30. And of course, the people who benefited from this slave system were the slave owners. But in fact, the slave owners weren't even the 20%. Most of the 20% were other non-slave population that were working for the large plantation owners. And if you look at the landowners, even those were the most privileged. If you actually look at the island, there were a handful of families, a couple of dozens, who were the huge landowners that owned most of the land, most of the productive land. So how was it that a very, very fertile land in the middle of the most profitable trade of the 17th and 18th centuries, sugar trade, was based on an economic system that benefited a handful of families at the expense of 80% of the population that were so badly treated that they were they were dying of malnutrition, overwork, and sometimes even starvation? Well, the answer is very clear. The slavery system, the plantation system, was based on coercion. These people weren't doing that sort of slaving voluntarily, they were being coerced to do so. Well, what sort of political power, what sort of political institutions were supporting it? Well, if you look at the details, it seems pretty straightforward. The political institutions, are about distribution of political power. Who controls the military? Who controls the political decision making? Who controls the judicial system? In all of these areas, if you look at Barbados, you see the fingerprints of the same set of families. The top judges on the island who came from the families that controlled the most profitable land. The top commanders on the island that controlled coercion came from the same families. The top governors, politicians came from the same island. So the structure that sort of emerges is a special one, but I think is an illustrative one, where economic institutions are extractive. They create a tilted playing field, advantaging one group at the expense of a lot of the rest of the society. And the political institutions are very tilted also. They provide all of the political power to a small group that is then able to coerce the rest of society in order to be able to set up and maintain those economic institutions. So inspired by that sort of reasoning, we call the set of political institutions that are sort of illustrated by the Barbados example, extractive political institutions, because they naturally coexist with these extractive economic institutions. And again, the ideal type at the other extreme, and of course the reality is somewhere in between, both for economic and political institutions, but the ideal type at the other extreme, for symmetry, let's call them inclusive political institutions. Inclusive political institutions are those that distribute political power equally so that it's not monopolized by one group, such as the plantation owners, and provide lots of ways of checking how that power is exercised so that one individual, even if it's elected, is not able to monopolize power and do whatever he or she or her group or his group or her ideological kin really want. So therefore, inclusive political institutions are about an equal distribution of political power. Extractive political institutions are a distribution of unequal distribution. There is a natural affinity between inclusive economic and political institutions. They tend to support each other, and as the Barbados example illustrates, extractive economic and political institutions support each other. This is not to mean, and I'm going to come back to this, that there is going to be a one-to-one correspondence. Many societies at various points in time may be off diagonal, inclusive economic institutions, but extractive political institutions, or vice versa. But those are going to be somewhat more unstable. There are going to be forces to pull them in one direction or another. So how does this all work, and how does this help us understand these huge gaps that we observe? Well, I'm not going to go too much into the detail because that part of the story is a little bit more of a standard economic story. And the standard economic story is that the engine of economic growth, economic prosperity, is innovation, increases in productivity, investment. And sustained economic growth comes from this sort of innovation. And extractive economic institutions, though sometimes they could generate mobilized resources for catch-up or other sort of temporary growth bouts, like Barbados did, that became a very rich country because of sugar export, they're not going to be able to underpin sustained economic growth. They're not going to be able to underpin sustained economic growth because they don't really encourage innovation, new products, new technology. And so sustained economic growth is going to follow more from inclusive economic growth. And you see the sort of huge gaps emerge over time because societies that have more inclusive institutions have been growing fairly steadily, starting at some point, late 18th century, sometime in the 19th century, but many of the societies with extractive economic institutions, supported by extractive political institutions, haven't grown at all, or have grown in a much less consistent manner, and therefore a huge gap. So that's the very, very basic story with lots of gaps, which I'm going to indicate but not have time to fill them, except perhaps answer some questions that you might have all related to this. Instead, what I want to do in my sort of remaining 20 minutes or so, sort of give you one historical example to illustrate or to make it plausible to you why I'm arguing that this perspective is actually useful for understanding the world and the alternatives aren't so hugely useful. Of course, one historical example is one historical example. You can't generalize from it, but you know that's sort of the shortcoming of this sort of style is rather than statistical empirical evidence, historical examples sort of work best. But you know, I think what I can say is that what we're trying to sort of illustrate with historical examples is the sort of thing that other work by ourselves and others have sort of tried to establish in a more sort of statistical, econometric, evidence-based way. So let's take an example to think about these issues. And I think if you want to reason, think about institutional differences and economic growth, there is no better place to turn to than the continent on which we are located at the moment, the New World, the Americas, because most of the institutions that we observe around us in any part of the Americas, from Chile to Argentina to Canada, to all the way to Haiti or Mexico, are shaped by their colonization experience. After the discovery of the New World, Europeans colonized, came into contact with many different civilizations that existed in many different parts of this continent, and out of that, a new set of institutions emerged, and these countries that make up the Americas entered the age of the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, during which these growth heterogeneity emerged with very different sets of institutions. So let's try to understand where these institutions come from and at least get an inkling for whether and why they matter for economic growth. So let's think about institutions in the south of America. So the sort of the parts of America that are in general not as prosperous as North America, United States, and Canada. And of course, the stories of Cortez and Pizarro are well known to all of you. But I'm going to start with a Spanish conquistador who was as early as Cortez, but now nowhere as well known, Juan Diaz de Solis. Juan Diaz de Solis, which I presume many of you haven't heard of for good reason, was the sort of the leader of the Spanish conquistadors who started very early colonization of the southern cone of the continent, what is today Argentina and Uruguay, in 1516. So he went there with a fleet filled with two sorts of people, soldiers and goldsmiths, because the Spanish had a particular way of approaching the colonization, which was very much to extract resources, and for that you needed two things: soldiers to coerce and put sort of order on the people that they were going to find there, and the goldsmiths to actually evaluate and work with the gold. And so in 1516 they come ashore, but they have a very bad surprise waiting for them. Instead of the huge riches that were going to be offered to them with lots of natives, they encountered a largely empty terrain. The areas that they colonized were inhabited by, not by the Aztecs, not by the Incas, but by sort of very early stage civilizations, the Querandi and the Charruas, which were very sparsely settled, non-sedentary, non-hierarchical, largely hunter-gatherer. Spaniards tried to sort of capture them and put them to work, but they couldn't capture them because the population density was very low. Even when they were captured, they fought back and died rather than get captured. And even when they were captured, they wouldn't be put to work because they were unused to agricultural work or anything like that. And in the process of fighting back, actually some of them clubbed Juan Diaz de Solis to death very shortly after his arrival, and that's why he's not a very famous conquistador. So you're excused for not knowing. So Spaniards were just about to throw in the towel after several years of trying to struggle with the Charruas and the Querandi, but another one of the conquistadors, a man by the name of Juan de Ayolas, sort of sailed up the Parana River, and which is, goes up to where is the capital of Paraguay today, Asuncion. And there he found another band of Indians, the native people, the Guerani. Now the Guerani were not the Aztecs or the Incas either, but they were different from the Charruas and the Querandi because they were already sedentary. They already had a hierarchy. They had their own princes and princesses, and they, the elite, then the rest of the society were working for them in some sort of primitive hierarchical structure. So this was much more the sort of proposition that the Spaniards were after. They immediately overpowered the Guerani, They declared themselves as the elite. They married some of the princesses. They had the arms. They gave themselves a title, and they put the people to work. And you see there primitive forms of other economic institutions that they would develop in other places, such as the encomienda, a land grant, which was really a forced labor system, or other sort of forced labor systems, and essentially ways of extracting agricultural and other resources from the population. The same sort of events transpired in terms of the capture and the Spaniards setting themselves up as the elite in the Aztecs, in the Aztec territories, Inca territories. And you see the development of both extractive economic institutions and extractive political institutions. The political institutions were very much concentrated in the hands of the conquistadors and their allies who were doing the ruling for them, and the economic institutions were very much based on such things as the encomienda, the mita de repartimiento, which were very much these sorts of institutions to be able to extract resources from the bulk of the population for the benefit of the local elite, the Spaniards who were in the Americas, and of course the Spanish crown, which became very rich during this process. So what about the North America? So you might think that North America took an entirely different colonization path. You know, we all know the Puritan fathers. After all, they were colonized by the English, which were very different from the Spanish. But actually, there are a lot of parallels. So the first quasi-successful settlement in the North was the Jamestown colony. In the year 1606, a company by the name of Virginia Company, which was a company that had shares, people bought shares in that company, with the sole purpose of colonizing North America, which was the only part left to the English, because all the good parts were taken by the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the Virginia Company took 3 ships and sent them to what is Virginia today. That's why it was called Virginia Company. When the 3 ships came to the Jamestown colony, a small island at the mouth of the King James River. So those 3 ships were filled with, you guessed it right, soldiers and goldsmiths. Why? Because the English very much copied the colonization strategy of the Spaniards. The Spaniards were very successful. They made a lot of money. They were successfully able to set up these colonies and make money, and the shareholders of the Virginia Company wanted to make money. That's why they had invested quite large sums by the standards of the day. And the way to do that was to go there, overpower the local population, get their goal. But exactly the same set of events transpired. They went there and they encountered a bunch of sparsely settled, non-sedentary hunter-gatherers that were very uncooperative, and exactly the same sort of events transpired, and they started starving. But differently from the Spaniards, they had no option of being able to go up to another civilization like the Guarani or the Aztecs or the Incas, because there were no alternatives. All of North America was either empty or was filled by the sort of very sparsely settled civilizations, just like Virginia. So what happened? Well, the legend is that they were saved by the great enterprising behavior of George Smith. But be that as it may, whatever the truth of that is, the important thing is that soon the Virginia Company understood that their colonization strategy, copied from the Spaniards, was not going to work. So at that point they said, okay, fine, our colonization strategy based on the Spaniards won't work, but we can make it work some other how. They said we can import from Europe all these poor people who have nothing to do as indentured labor. They will come in essentially as a form of coerced labor. They will come in and in return for their passage to the Americas, they are bound as an indenture to work for so many years as very cheap labor, do exactly what we want, and they'll do the production, and the elites of the Virginia Company and the Jamestown colony, the governor, the military leaders, the soldiers, are going to do the extraction, and the Virginia Company's shareholders will make plenty of money. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like, let me read from the laws that the Virginia Company at this point passed under the leadership of the governor, Sir Thomas Dale, and his deputy, Sir Thomas Gates. So the law reads, No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anyone who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals ears of corn shall be punished with death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his own private use upon pain of death. So when you read this, you realize that this was not really a very happy, consensual place. By death. But there was a reason for it. It wasn't just pure cruelty. The most valuable resource in the Jamestown colony was labor, and that labor, the indentured laborers, didn't really want to be there. They wanted to go away and have their own land and produce whatever they wanted on that land and sell it, or if that was failing, they just ran away, or they went to the Indians and started the thing with the Indians. And that started cutting into the profits of the Virginia Company, and that's why they passed these draconian laws. But no matter, whatever threats the Virginia Company made, they couldn't stop the exodus of the indentured servants or the resistance of the indentured servants. And a mere 11 years after its founding in the year 1618, the Virginia Company truly threw in the towel. They said, fine, we're not going to be able to make this colony work in the way that we envisaged it, as I would call it, as an extractive colony. And they did a first in the history of the Americas. For the first time, they introduced private property in land. So they said, fine, from now on, you can have some amount of land for every indentured laborer, for every settler now they would be. And you can produce whatever you want on this, and you can sell it to whatever you want. It's your private property. Before then, there was no private property in North America. There was no private property in South America. That's why the encomienda was a land grant, because the land was owned by the state or by the crown, and then it was making a grant to the whoever people wanted to, and most importantly, was making a grant of the labor on the land. So this was the beginning of inclusive economic institutions, and didn't come out of the goodness of the heart of the governor of the Virginia Company. It came because they had no option. They had sort of run out of their own steam with their own strategy. But the problem was that was the beginning of the inclusive economic institution, but the settlers, the indentured laborers, would be excused to not fully trust this economic institution. There were Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale just a year ago telling you that you would be hanged by the gallows for trading an ear of corn, and now they tell you, you can have whatever secure property rights and we are protected. So there was a disconnect between political power, which was still in the hands of the Virginia Company and the Jamestown governor, and the economic institutions, which were now becoming more inclusive. So 1 year later, in 1619, the other shoe dropped. And now they said, okay, fine, you can have your General Assembly, and the Jamestown colony is going to be self-governed. So what this sort of episode illustrates is several things. First of all, in contrast to the South, where you see the origins of the extractive institutions, here you see the origins of inclusive economic and political. And in fact, it's quite clear, I think, that the divergence between the South and the North had nothing to do with geography, had nothing to do with culture, had nothing to do with enlightened leadership. You see that divergence start in the 19th century in earnest. And it starts because inclusive economic institutions that have taken much stronger roots in the North by now really encourage people to get engaged with commerce and industrialization. There are lots of people coming from all walks of life coming up with patents and innovations and opening factories, trying to compete with each other. And then you see that South America is a very, very different type of economic development. There is very little industrialization. Whenever there is industrialization, it's the form of a government-sanctioned monopoly given to people who are supported by the political elites, and they are doing it effectively and not very well. Does this have anything to do with geography? Well, it's hard to make that case. It wasn't the case that somehow North America was geographically endowed, and that's why sort of different things emerged. In fact, the South was as geographically well endowed. If anything, the more dense populations, as I've just recounted, existed in the South. They existed in the Central America prior with the Maya, in the Mexico Valley with the Aztecs, and what was Peru or Bolivia with the Incas. So if anything, if you go with ability to have high agricultural output to support large populations, it was the South that was doing very well, the North that wasn't doing very well. But even that's irrelevant. You know, some of the places that Juan Diaz de Solis and his men colonized were places like Buenos Aires and the surrounding areas around it, which are so productive that they became the basis of Argentina's huge export boom in the 19th century and early 20th century. But they had no interest in that because they didn't have the manpower to use these areas. So geography had very little to do with it. Would it be that culture had to do with it, something to do with it? After all, you know, the English, had different culture. They had different religion. They greeted each other differently. They had different culinary taste. They bowed differently in front of their kings. All of that may be true, but the remarkable thing is that all of that cultural differences didn't mean much. They had exactly the same colonization strategy. The English, almost to the letter, followed the Spanish system. But they deviated from it when it didn't work, whereas it worked for the Spanish, and it didn't work because the conditions on the ground were different. So it's very difficult to make a case in this instance that cultural factors were hugely important. What about enlightened leadership? Well, again, it goes the other way around. If enlightened leadership is about leaders doing the things that they want, the more enlightened leaders were people like Cortes and Pizarro, who got what they wanted. They wanted to have all the gold, and they succeeded. Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Gales were abject failures. They went home, you know, with their tails between their legs because they failed in everything they wanted to do. So enlightened leadership seems to have very little. Instead, what really accounts for the divergent paths, as I have indicated, is the differences in economic institutions, undergirded by differences in political institutions. These political institutions emerged in South America and North America in different fashions because the interaction between the colonization strategies of the Europeans and the conditions on the ground led to different political dynamics, and those political dynamics built up into different political and economic institutions. Now, this of course is just one episode, as I said. We need much more systematic evidence, and we can talk about that. But there are also many, many other parts of this that I haven't talked about. Let me just give you, in my remaining 3 or 4 minutes,